Good evening and welcome to The Proof Is Out There. When you think of Sweden, I bet the first thing that comes to mind isn't UFOs. But the country has a small yet intensely dedicated UFO community. We open tonight with one of their most enduring and perplexing cases, Ta en titt. That means take a look in Swedish. At least I sure hope it does. It's November 11th, 1973, in the rural village of Pintaya, Sweden. 14-year-old Åke Lejeune is roaming the countryside with his niece's Instamatic camera when he sees a group of strange objects in the sky, and he's able to capture one of them on film. In a series of images, Åke captures a small black speck moving slowly across the sky. He's described it as a loaf of bread, but with more pronounced edges. It had a dark spot on top and continued to turn and become flatter. The rest of the body, he says, had a steel gray color and seemingly a slight yellow glow underneath it. And all of a sudden, a triangular object ejects from the loaf UFO. As Åke would later illustrate, the triangular craft flies much faster in an arched motion underneath the loaf and in the opposite direction. Åke claims it was a silver-white color and seemed like it was glowing. Author and historian Amy Title says Åke's incident wasn't as isolated as it may seem.
This sighting ties in with a large number of triangular-shaped UFO sightings in Sweden in the early 1970s. In the summer of 1970, triangular phenomena were seen and photographed over Jämtland. A triangular object was also seen and followed by a Lansen aircraft in June of 1971.
But out of all of these, Åke's sighting in particular drew special attention from Sweden's burgeoning UFO community.
Åke's case was thoroughly investigated by Gothenburg's Information Center for Unidentified Flying Objects. Their member magazine was known for its meticulous investigation of aerial phenomena. The investigation revealed that the negatives hadn't been tampered with. The images were authentic, and the UFO was a genuine mystery.
In the 50 years since, ufologists have spent decades trying to figure out what Åke saw.
Because the sighting was in such a remote location, it's very possible that what Åke saw was actually a secret military aircraft being tested. Other militaries have also tested their aircraft in the same region above the Norwegian Sea. It's possible that what this is actually a Russian aircraft. Åke is 14 years old when this happens, so it's also possible that Åke didn't understand what he saw. Or it's possible Åke saw something more mysterious and we don't know what it is.
What is so compelling about these blurry photos that we're still talking about them 50 years later? Let's look at the loaf of bread photos first. Each one is a bit different. The lighting is different. The coloring is different. You'd expect to see some of that in a moving object. And then there's the triangle image here. Much harder edges, more aerodynamic, almost more menacing. Let's see how our experts take on this 50-year mystery. First, we asked Rich Hoffman of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies if Åke could have stumbled upon a remote test by a secret military aircraft. He's uncertain if we're looking at a human aircraft at all.
You can't really make out any kind of propulsion, no engines, nothing that's keeping it up in the air. It's the lack of clarity on the actual photos that makes it very hard for us to determine anything about it.
One thing that could add clarity to the grainy photos is this collection of sketches from the witness himself. Some have pointed out that the triangular silhouette and the triangle craft he drew both resembled the Saab 37 Viggen jet, a Swedish combat aircraft developed in the 1960s.
And that could have explained this triangular-shaped object if they were flying around in that area that was very much a double delta-winged aircraft, very much like this.
But that wouldn't explain the object's ability to morph into different shapes, as shown by both Åke's drawings and photos. Could we be looking at a speck of dust inside the camera? Well, those would create the same shape of artifact on each photo, and in these images, the object is clearly changing shape. So maybe the speck was something like a gnat that was so close to the camera that it appeared out of focus. But our photo expert, Andrew McCarthy, doesn't think so.
OK was using an Instamatic, which was a very popular point-and-shoot film camera at the time. This point-and-shoot camera had a very small aperture lens. It was designed to be able to shoot at infinity easily without requiring any kind of manual focus. If this object is more out of focus, it'd be more transparent and have less contrast. So since this is as dark and as defined as it is, we know that any blur that we're seeing from this object is most likely caused by motion blur.
So what could we possibly be seeing?
While I don't think these photos are a hoax, there is no plausible explanation for them. We have no explanation for why this loaf-shaped UFO just hovered for a few minutes and why this triangular-shaped UFO was ejected from it. There's just not enough information in this story to make a conclusion. This photo is a true UFO.
Our verdict? We're calling this a genuine UFO. The journalist who documented Ok's sighting concluded there was no reason to doubt his information. He left it to his readers to decide, and we leave it to you, the viewers. Now we pivot from an old UFO to a new UFA, an unidentified flying animal. The fossil records show that at least 6 different dinosaurs lived in Idaho millions of years ago. And this video suggests that one creature from the Cretaceous age might still be living there today. September 4th, 2015, Boise, Idaho. A pedestrian is walking on a crisp gray day when they notice something alarming overhead. And record this. A large pterodactyl-like creature with a massive wingspan glides overhead. The wings pull back, then flap several times before the animal soars out of view. Let's watch that again. There's a notable triangle-shaped face leading to a point on the back of the skull. And beyond the massive wings, there appear to be 2 legs. We can clearly see the brownish skin as the creature dives, then glides past the trees. Field researcher Ken Gerhardt is excited to see such footage.
So this clip is really near and dear to my heart because for decades I have been actively researching accounts of living pterosaurs or pterodactyls. I've interviewed dozens of people that swear that they've seen these giant flying reptiles, not birds.
The pterosaurs, who supposedly went extinct 65 million years ago,
the first flying vertebrates were the pterosaurs, and they were a highly specialized form of flying reptiles. They evolved into these massive pterodactyls with wingspans up to 36 feet long, making them the largest flying animals ever.
Pterosaur fossils have been found on every continent, including Antarctica. But how the heck could one be flying around Idaho today? Gerhardt is reminded of another sighting, one that became famous in the days of the Wild West.
There's a famous story from 1890. Cowboys riding in the Whetstone Mountains sighted this giant creature. They'd supposedly shoot this thing with their rifles and kill it. And they brought it back to town. There was a photograph which appeared in the Tombstone, Arizona Epitaph newspaper. And this photograph purportedly shows something that looks exactly like this animal. What's really strange, though, is that the photograph seems to have disappeared.
While hundreds of people claim to remember seeing this photo, there's still no physical evidence of it to this day. However, a number of strange photos featuring cowboys and winged creatures have surfaced over the years, although most, like this one, were easily proven fake.
If the famous Tombstone photograph does exist, it actually does prove that these animals did survive into modern times.
Gerhardt points to another possible theory, not from the Old West, but from a dystopian future.
There are some people that have actually tried to construct drones that have a very organic appearance, resembling birds or other animals. In fact, technicians at New Mexico State University have been actively working to build what's called an ornithopter, which is essentially a mechanical flying device which utilizes wings like birds and pterosaurs and other animals.
These ornithopters are using actual bird carcasses for the casings of their machines as a way to blend in and monitor wildlife. Could we be looking at similar tech?
I think we can't discount the possibility that this is in fact a modified and actually a very cool-looking drone.
Idaho isn't the only place where sightings like this have been reported. In a prior season, we investigated a supposed raptor running around Florida. And a living pterosaur has allegedly been seen flying above Papua New Guinea and its surrounding islands. As for this Idaho footage, let's let our experts swoop in and do their thing. Wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka is skeptical that what we're seeing here is a 65-million-year-old creature.
If a creature this large were able to survive, it would need prey to survive on, like cows or calves, sheep or goats. Because it would need to hunt for food across a large area, it would most likely be seen by humans before this one video.
Manka also suggests that some of these creatures' movements are anything but organic.
So here it looks like this pterosaur is going to dive down, but then it lifts its head back again without really being able to recover. It would need more distance from the ground to go back up again. They're not able to defy gravity, and it definitely makes me question if this is real.
So could this be a taxidermied drone, like the ones being created at New Mexico State University?
The idea of using real birds as drones is enthralling, but although birds do have a hinge right here, their wings don't bend upwards like that. That would be like me being able to bend my elbow backwards. This is not anatomically correct. This isn't a drone in a taxidermied bird.
Our next stop was to see what video forensic analyst Michael Primo could tell us about this aerial enigma.
A software program created this file, not a digital video camera. This video definitely appears to be processed. There's no direct source of light that in theory would produce these tonal values underneath the wings. So that would be more of an indication that something was changed on the underside of those wings.
Although Primo thinks this is a fake, even he has to admit it's a pretty impressive one.
The metadata and structural analysis doesn't give us any kind of indication as to what program may have done this or how it was done. This could very well be one of the best CGI videos that I have ever analyzed.
Our verdict, based on Manka's observations and Primo's video analysis, we're calling this a hoax. But be warned, now that AI has entered the field of photo manipulation, generating fakes like this will soon be as easy as typing a sentence. We'll do our best to stay one step ahead of the charlatans. Our next story is a strange one, and it includes graphic images of mutilated animals some might find disturbing. Viewer discretion is certainly advised, but viewer attention is encouraged. 2018, we're in my home state of Georgia, in the town of Austell, just outside Atlanta. This is the area where the Chattahoochee River runs underneath the I-20 interstate. Jason Olseth, the Chattahoochee River keeper, documents anything that doesn't belong here. This certainly qualifies. There's not one, not two, not three, but many, many dead goats floating downstream or washed up on riverbeds. And take a closer look, if you can, they're all missing their heads.
This was something that was clearly decapitated and then purposely put in the Chattahoochee, which we've never ever seen that before. Knowing that somebody had brutally cut the head off of this animal and purposely dumped it in the river is pretty unsettling.
And this wasn't a one-time thing. It's become a nearly daily occurrence.
Now, I've seen it thousands and thousands of times. I mean, I see so many of them, I don't even slow the boat down.
Anthropologist Kathy Strange says some suggested a large local predator could be to blame.
In 2019, a 13-foot alligator was found near Atlanta. It was so large that people thought it was a hoax, but after the Georgia Department of Natural Resources came in, they verified that it was a real alligator. It's very likely that if a goat was there on the shoreline and they were hungry, they would clearly go for it.
Others on the internet are reminded of other similar livestock mutilations, an alleged hallmark of alien activity.
In 2016, in Brazelton, which is near Atlanta, cows were found bloodless, but they had these neat little circles carved into their rear ends. Usually, aliens are the ones that are blamed for this. That might explain what it is that we are seeing here.
Journalist MJ Banias discusses another theory circulating the web about who could be responsible: practitioners of Santeria.
Santeria originates in the Afro-Caribbean, Latin American part of the world and essentially involves the sacrifice of animals for various mystical reasons, like bringing good luck.
Down in Florida, similar incidents have occurred wherein supposed practitioners of Santeria left the remnants of sacrificed animals along railroad tracks for good luck.
Whoever is doing this needs a significant amount of luck if they have to sacrifice this many goats. So who would have the ability to fund the purchase or theft of these goats? A lot of local press and a lot of investigators have pointed to potential drug cartels that are engaging in this practice. It's no secret that Pablo Escobar would run drugs from Miami, Florida into Atlanta, Georgia. So if there are drug cartels vying for territorial dominance, any little bit of luck can help.
Whatever is going on, it needs to stop. This river is drinking water for 5 million people. The water is much less polluted than it used to be, thanks in part to the River Keepers organization. But this has the potential to turn things back around, both environmentally and socially. No one wants to see a headless goat while they're paddling down the river. Let's see if our experts have any ideas. First, wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka considers if this could be the work of a killer alligator.
From the way these goats look, it doesn't really look like they're taken by a predator. It just seems like the head has been cut off. It doesn't seem like it's been ripped or torn. Also, if it were an alligator, I would expect there to be tears across the body, like tearing from pulling the fur as it tried to consume the animal. And why would a predator only take their heads?
So, if it's not a gator, could alien activity explain these creepy corpses?
I have a hard time believing that this was caused by aliens. It doesn't seem like there was any sort of advanced technology or lasers to make a precise cut. To me, this cut looks like it could have been easily done by a human with a knife. The heads are almost like hacked away.
As for Santeria, we consulted with Professor of Social Ethics Miguel de la Torre, whose parents were practitioners of Santeria.
This, I don't believe, is part of a traditional way of sacrificing animals in Santeria. Whoever was doing this really didn't know what they were doing. It's not really the way the religion operates. You may do a sacrifice once in your life when you have a specific problem, but that you shouldn't be killing a goat a couple of times a week.
De La Torre says these headless goats are just the latest in a long line of animal mutilations mistakenly blamed on Santeria culture.
You see movies that stereotype an entire Caribbean people as being less than, when in fact, this is a religious tradition that has lasted for centuries. This has nothing to do with Santeria at all. I have no idea what it could be.
Our verdict, unexplained animal slaughter. We're not totally sure why these goats keep ending up headless in the river, but we agree with our experts that these cuts appear to be performed by some untrained human hand. Whatever's going on, we can only pray it stops. We've never done a story on stigmata, the alleged appearance of wounds on the bodies of devout Christians that correspond to the crucifixion wounds of Jesus Christ. While the phenomenon has been a central part of Christian mysticism for centuries, we just never saw any footage of it worth investigating. Until now. It's 1987 in a suburb of Damascus, Syria. 23-year-old Myrna Nazor is experiencing a strange affliction. If you're squeamish about blood, you might want to cover your eyes. With the cameras rolling, Myrna lies in bed as blood pours out in a cross shape across her forehead and down her nose. There are also painful, bloody cuts on the palms of her hands and the tops of her feet. Myrna says these mysterious marks first appeared in 1983 when she was 19 years old and a new bride.
يعني أنا بعد ميرنا مثل ما هي بس بالإضافة إنه أنا عندي رسالة ربنا اختارني لحتى أنا أوصلها. رسالة العذراء ويسوع هي وحدة الكنيسة.
Myrna says that after this first incident, these strange wounds appeared again on the next 4 Holy Thursdays, when the Orthodox and Catholic Easters lined up, each time lasting for only about 3 hours.
في أطباء كتير فحصوا فحصوا جروحات، فحصوا العمق تبعهم، فحصوا قديش فحصوا الدم اللي طلع مني كمان من الجروحات. كلهم بيقولوا إنه ما في أي تفسير طبي.
Author Alexis Brooks says many believe that what Myrna has experienced over the years is an example of stigmata.
The term stigmata basically is a process in which individuals can exude blood from their hands, the crown of their head or forehead.
These wounds correspond with the wounds Christ received from being nailed to the cross by his hands and feet and being forced to wear a crown of thorns on his head. According to the Bible, the phenomenon has been noted throughout history.
Probably one of the most famous is St. Francis of Assisi, who was said to exude blood from the palms of his hands as well.
A more recent reported case is from the 20th century in Italy.
In 1918, an Italian priest by the name of Padre Pio was said to have blood emerge from his hands and feet. Interestingly, it said that the blood that emerged from his hands smelled of roses. The smell of roses is the odor of sanctity.
As the debate continues on the miraculous nature of these events, the Vatican has announced a new dedicated commission that will investigate mystical phenomena around the world. The center will look into weeping statues of the Virgin Mary, stigmata, and other apparitions. For now, let's see what our experts conclude about Myrna's recurring wounds. First, Dr. Ed Hope considers if Myrna's condition could be psychosomatic.
Psychosomatic medicine deals with medicine where the symptoms turn out to be to do with something psychological. It certainly could cause the symptoms of pain, but what it's not going to cause is this bleeding here that would not be possible just from a psychological problem.
So since her condition is clearly physical, could Myrna be suffering from a rare medical condition?
One disease that can cause blood to come out of nowhere is hematohidrosis, which basically means blood coming from the sweat glands. The tiny blood vessels around the sweat ducts end up breaking open and the blood ends up coming out on the surface of the skin. I don't think is what's going on here because we can see a direct area that the blood's coming from rather than a diffuse area that you'd get if you were bleeding from your sweat.
So since Myrna has visible wounds, is it possible they were self-inflicted?
We have to think of the possibility of a factitious disorder imposed on oneself. This is where people feign medical conditions in order to get the attention of medical professionals and medical care.
Hope says that can be pulled off using carbolic acid.
It's a highly caustic and corrosive substance that would burn the skin and cause death of the skin tissue.
And Dr. Hope sees some notable differences between Myrna's wounds and those of Christ on the cross.
When we really think about what Jesus would have actually experienced, it would have been a puncture wound. He had nails driven through his hands, rather than this very thin laceration here, which looks like it's been created by a very small and sharp blade. And this practice actually happens in pro wrestling called blading or juicing, where they create very fine nicks using concealed blades that create a large blood flow.
But Catholic miracle researcher Michael O'Neill points out that all the evidence is caught on camera.
Because they know exactly the dates when it will happen, and scientists and doctors have been able to test and videotape these occurrences, they can see that there is no wound, and then the camera shows the wound appearing and the wound closing. There's absolutely no chance that this is her inflicting the wounds on her own body. This seems to be an authentic case of stigmata.
Our verdict. The Vatican has thus far made no official judgment. But based on the film documentation and eyewitness accounts of Myrna's experiences, we're deeming this a possible miracle. Yet there is still not quite enough irrefutable evidence to confirm Myrna's claims of being marked by God. Many people continue to wonder if there could be life on Mars. But for the red planet to support life as we know it, there would need to be some sort of water source. Could this next photo prove that our planetary neighbor not only has water, but a whole plumbing system? It's May 2000 on Mars. NASA's Mars Global Surveyor probe is sending back photos from its mission to study and map the whole surface of the red planet. But as researchers are going through the pictures, one image is nothing like anyone could have expected. In the right corner of the black and white photo are what appear to be several long tube-like objects embedded in the sand or rock. Let's take a closer look. They feature a series of parallel ridges, almost like a massive corrugated pipe. Former aerospace engineer Mike Berra, who has been studying Mars for more than 2 decades, thinks this anomaly merits further attention.
As a structural engineer, what I saw was what looked like a series of repeating, supporting structural objects that don't look entirely natural.
Mike thinks it might be proof of the existence of some sort of past Martian civilization.
It could have been some sort of hydraulic tube. It could be a way of moving water around the very barren Martian surface, or it could have even been a transport tube. And when you look at this as a glass tube, you see that there's like a compartment there, almost like a little train that got stuck in this corner and couldn't make the turn, and now it's sort of encased there forever.
Corrugated pipes can twist and turn. So author Jason Martell says some suggest this could have been an ancient aqueduct that used gravity to divert water.
NASA recently amazed the UFO community with the announcement that there's evidence for a contemporary liquid water movement on the Martian surface.
NASA says it seems some dark streaks on Mars are actually running water flowing downhill. Still, others claim these formations aren't pipes, but an entirely different sort of structure.
Could these have been some type of a transport tube, also known as pneumatic tubes? Pressure is used to move objects through a network of tubes, possibly from some type of sentient alien that had otherworldly machine parts, which now lay embedded in the red planet's dirt.
NASA has been monitoring Mars since the 1960s, yet thus far, they haven't been able to detect any indisputable signs of life. Are their cameras missing the big picture? Or is the idea of life on Mars better suited for comic books? Let's get a better read from our experts. To kick us off, could these be broken and ancient pneumatic tubes from an alien transport system? NASA geologist Dr. Bob Anderson doubts it. He says this design would be needlessly complex.
If you look at modern transport systems on Earth today, hypertrains and stuff, you don't find these kind of junctions here. Why don't you just run it directly from A to B?
To be fair, if these are ancient tubes, we may only be seeing fragments of them. But why haven't they been seen elsewhere on Mars? This likely also rules out them being something like an aqueduct system.
If this was created by an alien technology, I would expect to find something that dug the hole up, any kind of a pumping system to get the water to go anywhere. But there's no parts laid anywhere that could be seen in the image. And also, it's located in an area where you're not near the polar caps where most of the water is on Mars. Therefore, it doesn't even seem to be in an ideal location.
Yet, astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy believes that water does have something to do with the solution.
I think what we're looking at here is an ancient riverbed, either formed from flowing water or flowing lava that carved out this shape in the Martian terrain. Meanwhile, these lines were formed by sand being brought in by the Martian atmosphere, depositing it, much like sand dunes here on Earth.
And Anderson confirms this is not the only place where we see this on the red planet.
We do know that about maybe 3 billion years ago, Mars had a very valid hydrologic cycle. We had an ocean, we had streams. But since Mars has dried up about 2 billion years ago, what happens is that these channels or these cracks are left behind. And because of the depression there, the winds are flowing down those channels, forming these beautiful lines. So we've seen this all over the surface of Mars.
We have more than scratched the surface on this one. And although ancient aqueducts do sound interesting, we're going to flow in a different direction with our verdict and say that these are wind-blown ripples in sand dunes. Well, who knows? In another 2 billion years, advanced plumbing systems may end up on Mars. Stay tuned. Minnesota is home to some large attractions: Lake Superior, the Mall of America, and the legendary Paul Bunyan. But this next local hero is the most impressive Minnesotan we have ever featured on the show, hands down. It's August 2015 in Stacy, Minnesota. 52-year-old Jeff Dabe is at home being interviewed about the unique feature that sets him apart.
It's nothing new to me. I mean, it goes from birth.
He looks like an ordinary guy, 5'8", 260 pounds, until you see his arms and hands. Jeff's hands are a massive 14 inches around, and his forearms measure 19 inches in circumference. It's no wonder he's known as the real-life Popeye the Sailor Man. Jeff swears he doesn't take growth hormones and that his strength and size are all his own. It's something he's been able to take advantage of since he was young.
I started wrestling when I was 10 years old, and I wrestled all the way up to junior high and high school. I know I freaked people out when we had to go to weigh-ins. They were all nervous if they matched up to me, but I've never had a temper. Always been a gentle giant, you know.
Jeff also picked up arm wrestling and still competes today. In 2021, he became a world champion. So how does Jeff have these strong, massive forearms and hands? Some suspect he might have symptoms of gigantism or acromegaly.
Gigantism is caused by excessive production of the growth hormone in childhood, whereas acromegaly is characterized by excessive production of the hormone in adulthood. Both conditions are typically caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland.
Most people will recognize this next real-life colossus who had one of these conditions.
Andrei Rene Roussimoff, better known as Andre the Giant, was diagnosed with acromegaly in adulthood. He was so big and so strong that he actually used to move cars around as a prank.
Not only that, but Andre's fingers were so large that he supposedly couldn't fit them into the holes on rotary phones and had to use a pen to dial. Jeff can surely relate, but some wonder if he could have a different rare congenital disorder, Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome, or KTS.
KTS affects the development of bones, blood vessels, skin, muscles, and sometimes the lymphatic system. It's characterized by a port wine birthmark, a malformed limb, typically one of the legs, but sometimes the arms as well, and vein malformations.
And another theory. Growing up on a farm, it's possible Jeff may have been exposed to radiation out in the fields. The reason? Radioisotopes and radiation have been used in agriculture for decades, in fertilizers and pest control.
Radiation exposure can cause congenital disabilities. Azamat Kazazov was born in Mailusu, Kyrgyzstan. It's essentially built on radioactive waste. Kazazov has 12 fingers and 12 toes as a result of exposure to this radioactive pollution.
On top of using his oversized limbs to his advantage, Jeff says he can do pretty much anything a regular guy can do, though he prefers using a flip phone since it's easier for him to operate. So how did Jeff get his huge forearms and hands? Let's see what our experts have to say. We first asked anatomy and anthropology professor Dr. Jeff Meldrum if Jeff Dabe suffers from gigantism or acromegaly.
Oftentimes, this kind of a condition will affect a single limb, but not both limbs in such a symmetrical fashion. And tests showed Jeff did not suffer from a pituitary form of gigantism. He has not displayed any excessive growth in overall stature and size. There's only this disproportionate growth of just his forearms and hands.
So since it's not a pituitary gland issue, Dr. Ed Hope weighs in on the possibility this could be Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome or KTS.
KTS syndrome as a diagnosis for Jeff is not a bad one because he also has some port wine stains. But for me, he doesn't fit some of the other things going on because he has both limbs affected and also he doesn't have any kind of pain or loss of function.
Then what about those environmental factors, such as exposure to radiation?
Radiation is something that can damage your DNA, cause mutation, and therefore lead to excess growth, but it's not like the comic books. You don't get this lovely, perfect, structured growth. You get dysregulated, disordered growth. You get cancers. Jeff's had no history of radiation exposure or any history of acute radiation syndromes. He's also got no history of cancers or cataracts, which also can be associated with radiation exposure.
Our verdict? There's no known scientific explanation for Jeff's condition. It's possible he has KTS, since he's never been tested for this syndrome, though he doesn't have all of the symptoms. So it seems just as likely he was simply blessed with superhuman-like forearms and hands from birth. But hey, if you've got it, flaunt it. Finally tonight, our boss said we shouldn't have done this piece, but we just couldn't resist. It's out of Alaska, which is notorious for anomalous occurrences. In this case, a body of water appears to have a mind of its own. Or is your mind playing tricks on you? It's December 2022 in Anchorage, Alaska. A family is driving down the scenic Seward Highway along the turning-in arm of the Cook Inlet. The car is paused for a moment, but once it accelerates, something inexplicable happens.
When we start moving, it looks like it's still, and then you can tell it's moving again.
Whenever the car goes forward, the waves in the water seem to freeze. If it weren't for the brush going past in the foreground, it would look almost like a still photo.
It's so crazy.
It's probably just a trick of the eye, but journalist Aaron McCarthy says some observers online have commented that it looks like the water is buffering in real life.
Some have theorized that what we're seeing here is actually a rendering problem. Think about when you're playing a video game or you're trying to watch a movie on streaming and you don't have enough memory. And so what you're looking at kind of buffers or struggles to load.
McCarthy says some speculate that if that's what we're seeing, it could be because we're living in a computer simulation rather than a 3D reality.
So in video games, the environment renders around the characters as they play. The theory goes that the waves are lagging because we live in a simulation, and the computer program running the simulation doesn't have enough memory, so it's struggling to render the environment around the family.
Here's what's blowing my mind. If the water is moving to the right and the camera is moving to the left, you'd think it would appear that the water is moving faster instead of becoming still. But instead of getting our eyes checked, I think we should check with our experts. Forensic video analyst Michael Primo takes a closer look at the video to see if it's even real.
I have no concerns as to whether or not it was altered and manipulated because there was sufficient metadata as well as structural information about the file to identify as well as verify the device that produced it. Throughout that analysis of the metadata, we also noted the GPS information. And what we've determined is this particular location is at a lookout in Anchorage, Alaska.
So what this cell phone captured and where appears to be accurate. Does this mean we're in a Matrix-like simulation that's buffering? Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku investigates.
The simulation necessary to create the world of the Matrix far exceeds anything imaginable with the laws of physics. Every molecule, every atom has to be choreographed exactly to create the world of the Matrix. And that is far beyond anything that we can imagine on the planet Earth.
So physicist Dr. Matthew Shadagas considers if this is just an optical illusion.
In this video, we see effects caused by the fact that motion is relative. Our brain is going to assume that the ground is not moving when the vehicle is not moving, but will appear to move when the vehicle of the person who's shooting this starts to move.
Primo says what we're seeing is what's known as the parallax effect, something we've seen before with alleged cases of islands moving through the water and planes frozen in the sky.
In order for the parallax effect to be dramatic, which is essentially what we're seeing here, the speed of the vehicle has to be almost identical to the movement of that water. What we can do here to eliminate this confusion to the mind and the perception of motion is to crop out the foreground area, and that's where the human brain is focusing its attention. And then we can see that the body of water is actually still moving. It actually never stops moving.
In the long twilight of a rural American evening, where the air seemed to hold its breath between the chirring of cicadas and the distant bark of an unseen dog, the story that would later be cataloged, dissected, doubted, and endlessly replayed on screens across the world began not with a roar from the heavens, but with the distracted boredom of a teenager named Caleb Henson, who had stepped outside his parents' weathered farmhouse simply to escape the dull glow of his bedroom monitor and the Familiar gravity of a life that felt too small for the questions forming inside his head, and it was in that restless state, half dreaming and half resentful of how ordinary everything felt, that Caleb looked up and saw something that did not belong to the accepted vocabulary of the sky, a shape that refused easy language, hovering where stars should have been but moving with an intention that stars never possessed. And though his first instinct was to assume a trick of perspective, a reflection, a drone, or even fatigue, the object defied those assumptions by accelerating without sound, pivoting at angles that made his stomach tighten, and glowing not with the steady confidence of aircraft lights, but with a shifting luminescence that seemed almost biological, as if the sky itself had grown an eye and was now studying him back. And this was the moment that would later open the episode of The Proof Is Out There titled Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur Over. But for Caleb it was simply a moment of private rupture, the instant when certainty cracked and curiosity rushed in to fill the gap, and as he fumbled for his phone, hands trembling with the contradictory impulses of fear and wonder, he recorded footage that would later be scrutinized frame by analysts, skeptics, and believers alike, yet none of them would fully capture the sensation he felt as the object descended slightly, elongated, and then, in a movement that would fuel endless debate, appeared to unfurl something like wings. Though whether those wings were physical structures or artifacts of light would become one of the central questions of the investigation, and it was this winged quality that gave rise to the more sensational claim that followed. The idea that what Caleb had seen was not a craft at all but a flying dinosaur, a modern echo of ancient life resurrected in the sky, an idea that thrilled tabloids and horrified scientists in equal measure. And when the footage was eventually brought before the measured voices and calibrated skepticism of The Proof Is Out There, the hosts framed it not as a declaration, but as an invitation to ask how we know what we know, and how quickly the unknown is either dismissed or mythologized. Yet before any expert commentary could strip the moment of its raw immediacy, Caleb's own voice cracked through the recording, whispering a disbelief so pure it bordered on prayer, and that human sound, fragile and unguarded, became the emotional anchor of the entire case, because whatever hovered in the sky that night, it had undeniably changed the trajectory of one ordinary life, and as the show reconstructed the event, layering satellite data, air traffic logs, and atmospheric explanations over Caleb's footage, the narrative widened to include not just the question of what he saw, but why such sightings persist across cultures and decades, why the sky remains the preferred canvas for our deepest uncertainties, and as the analysts debated whether the object's motion could be attributed to parallax effects or advanced drone technology, another threat emerged, quieter but more unsettling. The idea that some phenomena resist reduction not because they are supernatural, but because our tools of measurement are still incomplete, and this tension between explanation and humility became the beating heart of the episode, mirrored in Caleb's own journey from reluctant witness to public figure, as he found himself interviewed, doubted, defended, and ultimately isolated by the attention his sighting drew, losing friends who accused him of chasing fame and gaining strangers who projected their own beliefs onto his experience. And the show did not shy away from this psychological dimension, examining how the act of seeing something inexplicable can fracture a person's sense of belonging, leaving them suspended between worlds much like the object they described. And as the title Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur, teased the sensational while delivering the analytical, it became clear that the true subject was not the creature or craft itself, but the fragile contract between perception and proof, a contract that modern media strains to uphold. And when one expert pointed out that the wing-like structures could be consistent with motion blur and low-light distortion, while another countered that the object's acceleration exceeded known drone capabilities, the viewer was left not with an answer, but with a sharpened awareness of ambiguity, and this awareness echoed the show's broader mission: to stand at the threshold of the unknown without either surrendering to fantasy or retreating into cynicism. And in the final moments of the first segment, as the footage played once more in slow motion, the narrator posed a question that lingered long after the screen faded to black, not asking whether Caleb had seen a UFO or a dinosaur or a trick of light, but asking instead what it means that in an age of satellites and sensors, a single teenage witness can still look up at the sky and encounter something that eludes our collective grasp, reminding us that the universe has not yet agreed to be fully understood. And it was this unresolved tension, this refusal to close the case, that made the story resonate beyond its runtime, setting the stage for deeper investigations, broader comparisons, and more unsettling possibilities in the parts yet to come, as the quiet countryside returned to silence. And the sky reclaimed its secrets, leaving behind only a grainy video, a shaken teenager, and a question that would not stay contained. When the second phase of the investigation unfolded, it no longer belonged solely to Caleb Henson, or even to the quiet stretch of land where his sighting had occurred, because once the footage aired on The Proof Is Out There, the image detached itself from its origin and began to circulate through the vast nervous system of the internet, where every pause, pixel, and flicker was isolated, enlarged, reinterpreted, and weaponized by audiences whose hunger for certainty far exceeded the available evidence. And in this widening arena, the story evolved from a local anomaly into a cultural event, drawing in amateur analysts who mapped the object's trajectory against star charts, retired pilots who claimed instinctive recognition of unnatural movement, digital artists who recreated three-dimensional models of the winged shape, and skeptics who insisted that the entire phenomenon could be reduced to a misidentified bat illuminated by distant farm lights. Yet what made this phase distinct was not merely the escalation of voices, but the way contradiction itself became the narrative's driving force, as each explanation spawned a counter-explanation, and certainty fractured into competing camps that reflected less about the object in the sky and more about the observers on the ground. And The Proof Is Out There leaned into this fracture deliberately, structuring the episode's continuation around the idea that truth in anomalous cases is rarely a straight line, but more often a convergence of imperfect perspectives. And so the show invited not only aerospace engineers and visual effects specialists, but also psychologists and historians, expanding the frame to ask why winged figures in the sky provoke such visceral reactions, reaching back into humanity's oldest myths of dragons, thunderbirds, and sky gods, suggesting that the flying dinosaur narrative did not emerge randomly, but rose from a deep reservoir of symbolic memory. And as this context was laid out, Caleb watched from his living room, feeling increasingly detached from the event that bore his name, because while experts debated shutter speed and depth of field, he remained haunted by a detail no algorithm could measure: the sensation of being watched, a feeling he hesitated to share publicly for fear of ridicule, yet one that gnawed at him during sleepless nights. And the show captured this internal conflict in a rare follow-up interview where Caleb struggled to articulate the difference between what the camera saw and what his body remembered, explaining that the object's presence felt deliberate, as if it had chosen to appear. And though the panelists responded cautiously, one acknowledged that witness perception includes physiological responses that cannot be entirely dismissed, opening a subtle but significant crack in the wall of strict material analysis. And it was within this crack that the episode placed one of its most controversial segments, a comparison between Caleb's footage and a series of historical sightings dating back decades, many of which described similar winged silhouettes moving silently across the sky, often dismissed in their time as mass hysteria or folklore, yet now eerily aligned when layered over modern video evidence. And while the show was careful not to declare continuity or survival of prehistoric creatures, the juxtaposition alone ignited intense debate, forcing viewers to confront the uncomfortable possibility that some patterns persist beyond our current frameworks of explanation. And as the narrative progressed, the investigation turned its gaze outward, examining environmental data from the night of the sighting, noting unusual thermal fluctuations and atmospheric conditions that could theoretically distort perception, but which also failed to fully account for the object's controlled movement. And this failure of explanation became its own form of evidence, not proof of the extraordinary but proof of limitation. And The Proof Is Out There emphasized this point repeatedly, reminding viewers that acknowledging gaps in knowledge is not an admission of defeat, but a prerequisite for discovery. Yet this intellectual humility contrasted sharply with the personal cost borne by Caleb, whose daily life had begun to erode under the weight of attention as classmates mocked him, local reporters staked out his home, and anonymous messages flooded his social media, alternating between worship and hostility, turning him into a symbol rather than a person. And the show did not sanitize this reality, instead weaving it into the narrative to illustrate how modern anomaly culture often consumes its witnesses, demanding certainty from those least equipped to provide it. And in one particularly striking moment, a media ethicist questioned whether society's obsession with extraordinary claims ultimately discourages honest reporting, suggesting that the pressure to either sensationalize or retract leaves no space for genuine uncertainty, a statement that resonated deeply with the show's overarching theme: And as the episode edged toward its midpoint, a new piece of information surfaced. A report from a nearby county of livestock behaving erratically on the same night, pacing, vocalizing, and refusing to enter barns. A detail that the show treated cautiously but did not ignore, connecting it to a long tradition of animal sensitivity to environmental anomalies. And while skeptics dismissed the behavior as coincidental, its inclusion underscored the episode's commitment to presenting a mosaic rather than a verdict, and this mosaic grew denser when a visual effects expert demonstrated how common video artifacts fail to replicate the specific deformation seen in Caleb's footage, arguing that while not impossible to fake, it would require a level of sophistication unlikely from a bored teenager in a rural area. Yet even this defense was met with counterarguments, reinforcing the idea that each step closer to clarity also steps deeper into debate, and by the time the segment drew toward its conclusion, the flying dinosaur label had been neither confirmed nor fully dismantled, instead transformed into a symbol of how quickly language rushes to fill explanatory voids, and the narrator's voice returned to frame the central question anew, suggesting that perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case was not the object itself, but the way it revealed our collective discomfort with not knowing. Our impulse to domesticate the unknown by naming it, whether as a drone, a dinosaur, or a delusion, and as the final frames lingered on the sky above Caleb's hometown, now empty and unremarkable, the episode left viewers suspended in unresolved tension, aware that the absence of answers does not diminish the impact of the question, and that some sightings function less as evidence of hidden creatures or technologies, and more as mirrors reflecting the limits of perception, belief, and proof in a world that demands immediate conclusions. And in this sense, Part 2 did not advance the case toward closure, but deepened its complexity, preparing the ground for further inquiry while honoring the discomfort that comes with standing at the edge of explanation, where certainty dissolves and curiosity takes its place. By the time the investigation entered its third phase, the case had crossed an invisible threshold, moving beyond the question of whether Caleb Henson's footage could be explained into the more volatile territory of what happens when explanation itself becomes contested ground. Because as the proof is out there continued to revisit the sighting, it became clear that the object in the sky was now less important than the human responses orbiting around it, and this shift was deliberate, reflecting the show's understanding that anomalous phenomena gain their true power not from what they are but from what they disrupt. And in this instance what they disrupted was the fragile boundary between science and belief, a boundary often assumed to be firm but revealed here as porous, negotiable, and emotionally charged. And the episode opened by reframing Caleb's experience not as isolated, but as representative of a broader pattern in which witnesses are pulled into a gravitational field of interpretation they cannot control, where scientific language, media narratives, and personal conviction collide, and this reframing allowed the show to introduce a new layer of analysis focused on institutional response, asking how official systems react when confronted with ambiguous data that carries high public interest but low empirical certainty. And to explore this, the producers examined declassified reports from aviation authorities and military agencies, noting that while none referenced a flying dinosaur, many contained language strikingly similar to Caleb's description. Terms like unknown aerial object, unconventional movement, and lack of propulsion, phrases that simultaneously acknowledged anomaly and avoided implication, and this bureaucratic caution became a focal point of discussion among the panelists, one of whom argued that such language is not evidence of secrecy, but of methodological restraint, while another suggested that persistent ambiguity within official records may inadvertently fuel speculation by signaling that something remains unresolved, and this debate mirrored the viewer's own dilemma, caught between trusting institutional expertise and sensing that expertise itself operates within constraints that may exclude rare or unprecedented phenomena. And as the show navigated this tension, it returned repeatedly to the image of wings. Because wings are not neutral shapes, they carry symbolic weight that bridges biology, mythology, and technology, and the episode devoted significant time to unpacking this symbolism, inviting a paleontologist to explain how our modern image of dinosaurs has evolved dramatically over the last few decades, with feathered fossils reshaping public understanding, making the idea of winged prehistoric creatures less fantastical than it once seemed. Yet the scientist was careful to stress that none of this supported the survival of flying dinosaurs into the present, emphasizing extinction timelines and ecological constraints, and still, The visual parallel lingered uncomfortably, reminding viewers that scientific knowledge itself is not static but subject to revision, a point underscored by a historian of science who noted that many ideas once dismissed as absurd later became foundational, though not without resistance. And this historical perspective did not argue for belief in Caleb's sighting, but for humility in the face of incomplete understanding. And it was here that the episode introduced one of its most subtle but provocative questions, not whether the object was real in a biological or technological sense, but whether our categories of real and unreal are sufficient to encompass all phenomena. A question that resonated deeply with Caleb, who in a private interview segment admitted that he no longer cared what the object was called, only that his experience be treated as sincere rather than sensational, and this plea exposed a fault line between media consumption and lived reality, as the show acknowledged that the act of labeling something extraordinary often strips it of nuance, flattening complex experiences into click-worthy terms like UFO or flying dinosaur. And as the investigation widened further, the narrative incorporated comparative cases from other countries, grainy videos from South America and Eastern Europe depicting winged shapes moving against cloud cover, each accompanied by similar cycles of excitement, debunking, and lingering doubt. And while the show avoided asserting a global pattern, the repetition itself suggested that certain forms recur in anomalous reports, raising the possibility that human perception plays a role in shaping what is seen, a concept explored through cognitive science, with an expert explaining how the brain seeks familiar patterns when confronted with ambiguous stimuli, especially under stress or surprise. Yet this explanation did not fully satisfy critics, who pointed out that pattern recognition alone cannot account for the object's reported speed and trajectory, and so once again the case resisted closure, balancing on the edge of competing explanations without tipping decisively into any one of them. And as the episode progressed, the emotional temperature rose, reflecting the growing polarization among viewers, some accusing the show of legitimizing pseudoscience, others praising it for refusing to dismiss eyewitness testimony outright, and the producers addressed this controversy head-on. In a segment about the responsibility of investigative media, arguing that exploration does not equal endorsement, and that the role of such programs is to illuminate uncertainty rather than erase it, and this philosophy shaped the closing movement of Part 3, which returned to the night sky itself, inviting an astronomer to contextualize human observation within the vast scale of the universe, noting that even with advanced instruments, much of what exists remains unseen or inferred, and that rarity does not equate to impossibility, a statement that carefully stopped short of validating extraordinary claims while still affirming the limits of current knowledge. And as this cosmic perspective settled in, the camera cut back to Caleb standing outside once more, months later, looking up at an empty sky, reflecting on how the sighting had altered his relationship with the unknown, explaining that he no longer expected answers, but had learned to live with questions, a transformation that the show subtly suggested may be the most authentic outcome of such encounters. And in its final moments, the narrator framed the case not as a mystery to be solved, but as a lens through which to examine our collective discomfort with ambiguity, asking whether the true challenge posed by the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, was not to science but to certainty itself, and as the screen faded, the absence of resolution felt intentional rather than frustrating, an invitation to continue exploring rather than to conclude, signaling that the investigation was far from over, and that the next phase would delve even deeper into the intersection of evidence, experience, and expectation, where the line between observer and observed grows increasingly difficult to define. As the investigation moved into its fourth movement, the proof is out there shifted tone almost imperceptibly, away from the dramatic polarity of belief versus skepticism, and toward a colder, more methodical landscape where explanations are manufactured, tested, discarded, and sometimes quietly archived, because once the public fascination reached its peak, the work of understanding what Caleb Henson captured on his phone became less about spectacle and more about process. And this was where the machinery of explanation revealed itself, slow, cautious, and often unsatisfying to those who crave revelation, yet essential to any serious inquiry. And the episode opened by revisiting the raw footage once again, not to provoke wonder this time, but to strip it down to data, converting light into numbers, movement into vectors, and uncertainty into measurable variables. And this transformation itself became part of the narrative, illustrating how extraordinary experiences are translated into forms that institutions can handle, and a video forensics specialist demonstrated how each frame contained layers invisible to the naked eye, compression artifacts, sensor noise, rolling shutter distortion, all of which could either mask or mimic unusual motion. And as these technical explanations unfolded, the show resisted the temptation to let them function as easy debunking tools, instead emphasizing how each analytical method introduced its own assumptions, and that assumptions, while necessary, shape outcomes, a point underscored when two experts using different software suites produced subtly different motion profiles from the same footage, neither conclusively disproving the other, and this divergence became emblematic of the case itself, where parallel analyses coexist without converging. And as the discussion deepened, attention turned to the environment surrounding the sighting, with meteorologists reconstructing atmospheric conditions from archived data, noting temperature inversions and humidity layers that could theoretically refract light in unusual ways. Yet even here, the explanation felt incomplete, because refraction alone could not account for the object's apparent change in orientation, the moment that viewers fixated on as wing-like movement, and so the episode lingered on that moment, replaying it at different speeds, angles, and color corrections, not to sensationalize it but to exhaust its interpretive possibilities, and in doing so, the show highlighted an uncomfortable truth, that even exhaustive analysis does not guarantee resolution, and this truth echoed through the personal arc of Caleb, who by now had begun to disengage from the constant discourse, expressing in a follow-up interview a sense of fatigue that bordered on grief, because the event that once felt singular and meaningful had been flattened into a technical problem for others to solve, leaving him feeling peripheral to his own experience, and this emotional displacement became a subtle but powerful thread, reminding viewers that behind every data set lies a human moment that cannot be fully quantified. And as the episode balanced this human dimension with technical rigor, it introduced a new comparative angle, examining how similar cases have historically been resolved, not by definitive proof, but by gradual fading from public attention. As interest wanes and newer anomalies take their place, and a media analyst pointed out that this cycle often masquerades as resolution, when in fact it is merely abandonment, unresolved questions left behind in favor of fresher mysteries. And this observation reframed the investigation yet again, suggesting that the fate of the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over case might not hinge on evidence at all but on attention economics, and this idea gained weight as the show documented how online engagement had already begun to decline, theories giving way to memes, outrage replaced by indifference, and in this quieting space, the investigation adopted a more reflective tone, asking what responsibility remains when the crowd moves on. And one panelist argued that this is precisely where serious inquiry should persist, away from the noise, even if it yields no dramatic conclusions. And to illustrate this persistence, the episode followed a small research group attempting to replicate the sighting conditions using drones, lights, and controlled flight paths, testing whether similar visuals could be produced unintentionally. And while some simulations approximated aspects of the footage, none reproduced the totality of motion and deformation seen in Caleb's video, a result that neither confirmed anomaly nor satisfied skeptics, but instead reinforced the central theme of partial explanation. And this theme reached a quiet crescendo when the show addressed the flying dinosaur label directly, tracing how the phrase emerged not from Caleb, but from secondary commentary, a metaphor hardened into a headline. And by unpacking this linguistic evolution, the episode demonstrated how language itself can distort inquiry, pushing perception toward extremes. And the narrator reflected on how naming is an act of control, a way to domesticate the unknown, whether through scientific taxonomy or sensational branding. And this reflection tied back to the show's broader philosophy, that the unknown does not demand belief or denial but careful stewardship. And as the episode approached its end, the focus returned once more to the sky, not as a canvas for speculation, but as a reminder of scale, with an astrophysicist noting that human technology has only recently begun to observe near-Earth space with any consistency, implying that anomalies may be less about intrusion and more about our delayed awareness, a statement that reframed the entire case as potentially mundane in the grandest sense, extraordinary only because of perspective. And yet, even this cosmic humility did not erase the unease left behind by the footage, because despite all analysis, simulations, and contextualization, something remained stubbornly misaligned, a small remainder that resisted neat categorization, and the episode did not attempt to resolve this remainder. instead allowing it to sit unresolved as the closing images rolled. The narrator concluding that perhaps the most honest outcome of the investigation so far was not an answer, but a clearer understanding of how answers are pursued, constrained, and sometimes deferred, and that in the space between certainty and curiosity, cases like teen UFO flying Dinosaur over continue to exist, not as proofs of the extraordinary, but as reminders that explanation is a process, not a destination. And as the screen faded, the sense was not of closure but of quiet continuation, a signal that the investigation was preparing to move beyond mechanics and into consequences, where the impact of uncertainty itself would become the next subject of inquiry. In the fifth part of the unfolding narrative, the proof is out there made a decisive turn away from instruments, simulations, and frame-by-frame dissections, choosing instead to follow the quieter, longer-lasting ripples that spread outward once the cameras leave and the experts move on. Because while data analysis can stall indefinitely, the human consequences of an unexplained event continue to evolve, often in isolation and without resolution, and it was here that the case of Caleb Henson revealed a deeper layer of significance, one that had less to do with what crossed the sky and more to do with what settled into the minds of those left beneath it. And the episode opened not with footage but with absence, showing the same rural landscape months later, unchanged in appearance yet subtly altered in meaning, as if the land itself now carried a footnote, and this visual metaphor framed the central question of Part 5. What happens after uncertainty becomes a permanent companion. And to explore this, the show followed Caleb through his daily routines, now stripped of novelty and attention, revealing a young man negotiating the awkward transition from public curiosity back to private life, a transition complicated by the fact that the questions he was asked to forget still followed him internally. And in a candid conversation, Caleb described how the sighting had fractured his sense of normalcy, explaining that he no longer looked at the sky casually, because every clear night carried the possibility of recurrence, a possibility that was neither hopeful nor terrifying but unresolved, and this lingering expectation became emblematic of the broader psychological impact of anomalous encounters, which the show examined through interviews with researchers who study witness aftereffects, noting that such experiences often produce a sustained state of cognitive openness paired with social withdrawal, as witnesses struggle to reconcile personal certainty with public doubt, and this tension was visible in Caleb's demeanor, his speech careful, his expressions guarded, reflecting a learned caution born from having his sincerity questioned. And as the episode widened its focus, it drew parallels between Caleb's experience and those of other individuals featured in past cases, highlighting a recurring pattern of isolation that emerges when extraordinary claims collide with everyday social structures. And this pattern raised uncomfortable questions about how society treats uncertainty, particularly when it arrives without institutional validation. And one sociologist argued that modern culture, despite its fascination with the unknown, remains deeply intolerant of unresolved ambiguity, preferring closure even if it requires dismissal, a tendency that leaves witnesses suspended in a liminal state, neither affirmed nor fully discredited. And this idea was reinforced through archival clips of historical cases where individuals faded from public memory. Without answers, their experiences absorbed into folklore or forgotten entirely, and the show suggested that this fading is not neutral but carries emotional cost, shaping how future witnesses choose to speak or remain silent. And as the narrative returned to the teen UFO flying Dinosaur over case, it examined how online discourse had shifted from debate to parody, a transformation that further distanced the event from its origin, turning a moment of genuine disruption into a cultural artifact stripped of emotional context. And this transformation prompted a discussion about the ethics of entertainment-driven investigation, questioning whether the framing of anomalies as spectacle undermines the lived realities of those involved. And while the show acknowledged its own role within this ecosystem, it also argued that responsible inquiry requires attention to aftermath as much as evidence, and this philosophy guided the remainder of the episode, which explored how unresolved phenomena influence belief systems over time, noting that while some witnesses move toward skepticism as a coping mechanism, others develop a heightened sensitivity to mystery, becoming more receptive to unconventional explanations, and Caleb's own trajectory appeared to fall somewhere between these poles, as he expressed neither belief in extraterrestrial visitation nor comfort with purely mundane explanations, instead occupying a space of cautious acceptance, a willingness to say I do not know without urgency to resolve it. And this stance was presented not as indecision, but as adaptation, a psychological strategy for integrating anomaly without letting it dominate identity. And the episode suggested that such integration may be the healthiest outcome available in the absence of proof. A notion supported by a clinical psychologist who emphasized that the demand for certainty often exacerbates distress, while tolerance for ambiguity can foster resilience. And this insight reframed the investigation yet again, positioning uncertainty not as a failure of knowledge, but as a condition to be managed. And as the show deepened this perspective, it returned to the symbolic power of the flying dinosaur narrative, not to debunk it, but to analyze its persistence, arguing that the image resonates because it collapses time, blending deep past with speculative present, embodying the fear and fascination that arise when established timelines are challenged. And this symbolic reading aligned with anthropological perspectives that view anomalous creatures as expressions of cultural anxiety during periods of rapid change. A lens through which the sighting became less about literal survival of prehistoric life and more about collective unease in an era where technology, environment, and knowledge evolve faster than comprehension. And this broader context allowed the episode to situate the case within a larger human story, one in which unexplained sightings function as pressure points revealing cracks in our explanatory systems. And as Part 5 progressed, the narrative began to shift subtly toward the future, asking not what this case proves, but what it prepares us for. And one futurist suggested that as observation technologies proliferate, society will encounter more ambiguous data rather than less, increasing the frequency of unresolved events. And this prediction reframed the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, not as an anomaly among anomalies, but as an early example of a new normal, where visibility outpaces understanding. And this idea carried both promise and unease, because it implied that the challenge ahead is not discovering the unknown, but learning how to live alongside it without distortion or denial. And the episode closed by returning once more to Caleb, now framed not as a witness, but as a participant in this emerging landscape, standing beneath the night sky with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with the trembling awe of the first footage, explaining that while he still did not know what he saw, he had come to accept that the experience did not require resolution to remain meaningful. And this acceptance served as the emotional anchor of Part 5, offering a quiet counterpoint to the demand for answers that often drives such investigations. And as the narrator's voice reflected on this shift, the episode concluded that perhaps the most enduring impact of the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, case lies not in expanding the boundaries of science, but in challenging the boundaries of patience, humility, and empathy, reminding viewers that some questions are not meant to be conquered but carried, and that in carrying them, individuals and societies alike reveal who they are when certainty is no longer guaranteed. And as the screen faded, the sense was not of an ending but of a long continuation, the kind that unfolds slowly, inwardly, and beyond the reach of any single explanation. As Part 6 unfolded, the proof is out there redirected its lens toward a less visible but deeply influential dimension of the case, the architecture that modern society has constructed around mystery itself. Because long before Caleb Henson lifted his phone toward the sky, systems were already in place to receive, process, classify, monetize, and ultimately neutralize experiences like his. And this part of the narrative sought to expose how those systems operate, often invisibly, shaping not only what we conclude about anomalous events, but how long we are allowed to dwell within them. And the episode opened by examining the pathways through which unexplained sightings travel once they are reported, moving from personal devices to social platforms, from viral clips to curated programming, and finally into archives that promise preservation but often deliver quiet containment. And this journey was mapped carefully, revealing how each stage imposes its own logic, its own filters of relevance and credibility. And as the structure emerged, the teen UFO flying dinosaur over case was positioned not as an outlier, but as a representative example of how mystery is managed in an age defined by constant documentation. And one media theorist explained that the abundance of recording devices has not eliminated mystery, but redistributed it, shifting uncertainty away from the question of whether something happened toward the question of what the evidence means. And this shift has profound implications, because meaning is far more contestable than occurrence, a point illustrated by the endless reinterpretations of Caleb's footage, each reflecting the priorities and assumptions of its interpreter. And as the episode traced these interpretive layers, it highlighted how authority is constructed in such debates, noting that expertise no longer resides solely in institutions, but is dispersed among influencers, commentators, and algorithmically amplified voices, creating a fragmented epistemology where consensus is rare and confidence often substitutes for verification. And this fragmentation became a central theme as the show explored how different communities had adopted the flying dinosaur narrative for divergent purposes, some as proof of suppressed truths, others as satire, and still others as symbolic commentary on environmental or technological anxiety. And this multiplicity of meanings did not dilute the case but multiplied it, turning a single sighting into a prism through which countless narratives refracted. And yet, amid this proliferation, Caleb himself felt increasingly peripheral, a paradox the episode addressed directly by contrasting his restrained, consistent account with the elaborate theories built around it. And this contrast raised ethical questions about ownership of experience, asking who has the right to define what an event signifies once it enters the public sphere. And while no definitive answer was offered, the show emphasized that this question lies at the heart of modern mystery culture, where personal testimony is both currency and collateral. And as the investigation continued, attention turned to institutional archives, those vast repositories of unresolved reports maintained by scientific agencies, aviation authorities, and private organizations. And an archivist described how most cases are neither solved nor debunked, but simply classified as unidentified and left dormant. A status that sounds dramatic, but often means forgotten. And this revelation reframed the teen UFO flying dinosaur over case once again, suggesting that its ultimate fate might not be resolution but archival silence. And the episode explored the psychological impact of this outcome, noting that unresolved classification can feel like erasure to witnesses, a quiet dismissal that carries more weight than open skepticism. And this insight resonated with Caleb's growing ambivalence toward official interest, as he admitted that the prospect of his sighting being filed away unsettled him more than criticism ever had, because it implied indifference rather than disagreement. And this emotional nuance added depth to the episode's exploration of consequence, reinforcing the idea that mystery does not end when attention fades, but transforms into something more private and enduring. And as Part 6 deepened its analysis, it also examined the economic structures surrounding anomaly, pointing out that mystery has become a renewable resource within media ecosystems, generating content cycles that thrive on unresolved questions. And while the proof is out there positioned itself as investigative rather than sensational, the episode acknowledged the inherent tension between inquiry and entertainment, questioning whether prolonged ambiguity serves understanding or simply sustains engagement. And this self-reflective moment marked one of the episode's most introspective turns, as the narrator considered whether the endless revisiting of footage risks turning uncertainty into spectacle, a concern echoed by a philosopher who argued that true respect for the unknown requires restraint, the willingness to stop short of narrative closure without filling the gap with exaggeration. And this philosophical perspective provided a counterbalance to the machinery of modern mystery, suggesting an alternative ethic grounded in patience and proportionality. And as the episode progressed, it revisited the symbolic resonance of the flying dinosaur image through this lens, proposing that such symbols persist not because they are accurate representations, but because they are emotionally efficient, capable of condensing complex anxieties into a single striking form. And this efficiency explains why such images spread rapidly even when evidence remains thin, a phenomenon the show connected to broader patterns of myth-making in digital culture, where speed often outruns verification. And yet, the episode resisted cynicism, acknowledging that myth and meaning have always coexisted with inquiry, and that the challenge lies not in eliminating symbolic interpretation, but in recognizing it as distinct from empirical claim. And this distinction became a guiding thread as the narrative returned once more to Caleb's experience, framing his sighting as a point of origin rather than a definitive statement. And in doing so, the show restored a sense of scale, reminding viewers that one moment, however disruptive, does not bear the burden of explaining the universe. And as Part 6 approached its conclusion, the focus shifted toward anticipation, not of answers but of recurrence, exploring how unresolved cases prime observers to expect repetition. And an astronomer noted that once a region gains notoriety for anomalies, subsequent reports increase, not necessarily because phenomena intensify, but because attention sharpens, a feedback loop that complicates interpretation. And this insight cast a new light on the rural landscape of Caleb's hometown, suggesting that the sky above it had become symbolically charged, a stage onto which expectation might project future meaning. And this possibility carried both wonder and risk, as heightened vigilance can enrich observation but also distort it. And the episode closed on this ambivalent note, returning to the image of the sky at dusk, neither empty nor revealing. As the narrator reflected that modern mystery does not reside solely in the unknown object, but in the structures we build around not knowing, structures that can either support careful inquiry or amplify distortion, and the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over. Case, still unresolved, now stood as a case study in how contemporary society negotiates the tension between evidence and imagination, speed and patience, visibility and understanding. And as the screen faded, the sense was that the investigation had reached a new layer, one less concerned with what appeared in the sky and more with what unfolds on the ground when mystery enters a world already crowded with explanations, signaling that the next part would push even further into the implications of living permanently alongside unanswered questions. Part 7 unfolded with a subtle but profound shift in emphasis, as the proof is out there turned its attention toward time itself, not as a measurable sequence of moments but as a force that reshapes meaning, because by now the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over. Case had begun to migrate from active investigation into something quieter and more elusive, the realm of collective memory, where events are no longer evaluated primarily for accuracy but for resonance, and this transition marked a critical threshold, since what society remembers often matters more than what it can prove. And the episode opened by examining how anomalous events survive beyond their moment of attention, tracing the slow transformation of fresh uncertainty into reference point, anecdote or cautionary tale, and in doing so it positioned Caleb Henson's sighting within a lineage of cases that initially burned brightly before settling into cultural sediment, cited not for resolution but for suggestion. And this framing allowed the show to ask a new question, not what happened that night, but what will be remembered about it 10 or 20 years from now, and who will control that memory. And as the narrative progressed, historians and sociologists described how modern memory is increasingly curated by digital platforms, where algorithms privilege engagement over nuance, shaping which fragments of a story persist. And this process was illustrated through a montage of how Caleb's footage appeared across time, first as raw video, then as annotated analysis, later as meme, and finally as brief reference in compilation videos about unexplained sightings. Each iteration stripping away context while preserving the most visually striking elements, particularly the fleeting wing-like motion that fueled the flying dinosaur label. And this reduction was not portrayed as malicious, but as inevitable, a consequence of how stories compress under repetition. Yet the episode emphasized that such compression carries consequences, because it replaces lived experience with symbolic shorthand. And Caleb himself became aware of this shift when he encountered his own sighting referenced casually online, detached from his name, his voice, and his uncertainty, a realization he described as unsettling, as if something personal had been abstracted into folklore while he was still alive, and this reaction anchored the episode's exploration of memory ethics, questioning whether unresolved events deserve preservation in their complexity rather than in their most entertaining form. And as the show widened its scope, it examined similar cases from the past century, noting how many once controversial sightings are now remembered only as footnotes there. Original debates forgotten, leaving behind simplified narratives that obscure the richness of the original inquiry, and this historical perspective suggested that the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, might eventually follow the same path, its unresolved nature smoothing into ambiguity rather than provoking it, and this possibility raised a deeper concern, that unresolved cases do not remain open forever, but slowly close through neglect, not because answers are found but because questions lose urgency. And the episode treated this as a form of quiet resolution that satisfies no one but stabilizes collective attention. And this idea resonated with a memory researcher who explained that societies manage uncertainty not by solving it, but by storing it at a safe distance, converting disruption into reference. And this conversion was illustrated through fictionalized future scenarios, imagined documentaries and articles that might one day mention the case briefly, framing it as one of many unexplained sightings from the early 21st century, a framing that would erase the intensity of debate, the personal cost, and the emotional texture that once defined it. And as these scenarios unfolded, the episode returned to Caleb, now months removed from public attention, reflecting on how his own memory of the event had begun to shift, noting that certain details felt sharper while others faded. And this admission underscored a central theme of Part 7. That memory itself is not static, even for the witness, but an evolving narrative influenced by repetition, doubt, and reinterpretation, and the show handled this delicately, avoiding any suggestion that fading or alteration equates to fabrication, instead presenting memory as a living process that interacts with external narratives. And as the investigation deepened this line of thought, it explored how unresolved anomalies function within collective identity, often serving as markers of possibility, reminders that not everything has been accounted for, and one cultural theorist argued that such markers are essential, providing spaces where imagination and inquiry can coexist, preventing knowledge systems from hardening into dogma. And this perspective reframed the flying dinosaur narrative yet again, not as a literal claim, but as a symbolic placeholder for the unknown, a vivid image that preserves openness even as specifics blur. And yet, the episode also acknowledged the danger of mythologization, noting that when symbols outgrow their origins, they can overshadow careful investigation, replacing curiosity with belief. And this tension between preservation and distortion became the emotional core of Part 7, mirrored in Caleb's own ambivalence toward how his sighting might be remembered, expressing hope that it would inspire curiosity rather than conviction. And as the narrative approached its latter half, the show examined the role of education and generational transmission, asking how future audiences might interpret such cases without direct exposure to the original context. And educators suggested that unresolved phenomena could be valuable teaching tools, illustrating the limits of evidence, the importance of critical thinking, and the ethics of uncertainty. And this pedagogical angle offered a constructive vision for the afterlife of the case, one where it contributes not to belief systems, but to intellectual humility. And this vision aligned with the show's broader mission, positioning the proof is out there not as an arbiter of truth, but as a curator of questions. And as Part 7 continued, it explored how the case had subtly influenced local identity in Caleb's hometown, noting that while residents rarely spoke of it openly, the sighting had become part of communal lore, referenced obliquely, embedded in shared memory without official acknowledgement, a phenomenon anthropologists described as low-intensity myth, stories that persist quietly without demanding belief. And this localized memory contrasted sharply with the global digital version, highlighting how scale alters meaning. And as the episode juxtaposed these layers of remembrance, it emphasized that no single version of the event would prevail, but rather a constellation of interpretations would coexist, each serving different needs. And this multiplicity was presented not as a failure of truth, but as an accurate reflection of how human memory operates, accommodating contradiction rather than resolving it. And as the episode moved toward its conclusion, the narrator reflected on the paradox that unresolved cases may endure longer than solved ones, precisely because they remain adaptable, capable of being reinterpreted by each generation. And this adaptability, while frustrating to investigators, ensures persistence within cultural memory. And the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over case now appeared poised at this threshold, no longer urgent but not forgotten, hovering between documentation and myth, much like the object that inspired it. And in the final moments, the show returned to the original footage one last time, not slowed or analyzed but played as it was first seen, raw and uncertain, accompanied by a reflection that memory often begins not with clarity but with disruption, and that how we choose to remember such disruptions reveals as much about ourselves as it does about the events themselves. And as the screen faded, Part 7 closed with the suggestion that the true longevity of the case would not be measured in answers, but in how it continues to provoke thoughtful engagement long after its moment has passed, setting the stage for the next phase of the narrative, where the future implications of unresolved memory would come into sharper focus. Part 8 advanced the narrative by turning decisively toward the horizon, asking not what the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over case had been or even what it had become, but what it signaled about the future landscape of uncertainty itself. Because by this stage the proof is out there recognized that the case functioned less as an isolated mystery and more as a rehearsal for a world increasingly saturated with ambiguous data, incomplete explanations, and contested interpretations. And the episode opened with a forward-looking premise that the coming decades will not necessarily bring fewer mysteries, but more of them. Not because reality has grown stranger, but because observation has grown more pervasive. and this premise reframed Caleb Henson's sighting as an early node in a widening network of recorded anomalies that strain traditional frameworks of verification. And to explore this shift, the show examined emerging technologies that promise greater visibility. From consumer-grade night vision devices to AI-assisted sky monitoring, tools that expand the range of what can be seen while simultaneously multiplying the volume of what must be interpreted, and experts caution that this expansion creates a paradox, as increased observation does not guarantee increased understanding, instead producing a surplus of signals that outpace consensus. And this surplus was presented as the defining challenge of the future, a challenge already evident in the prolonged debate surrounding Caleb's footage, which persisted not because evidence was scarce, but because it was abundant yet inconclusive, and as the episode traced this logic, it asked how institutions might adapt, questioning whether existing scientific and regulatory bodies are equipped to manage a steady influx of unresolved phenomena without defaulting to dismissal or sensationalism. And one policy analyst suggested that new categories of inquiry may be required, frameworks that acknowledge uncertainty as an endpoint rather than a temporary failure, a suggestion that marked a radical departure from traditional models of investigation. And this institutional question was mirrored on a personal level through Caleb's evolving relationship with the unknown, as he reflected on how the experience had altered his expectations of the future, noting that he no longer assumed that unanswered questions would eventually resolve themselves, an insight that the episode framed as both unsettling and liberating, because it challenged the narrative of progress as linear clarification, and instead proposed a model of knowledge that expands unevenly, leaving pockets of mystery intact. And as the narrative widened further, the show explored how future generations might normalize such pockets, growing up in a world where unexplained footage circulates regularly without demanding immediate resolution. And sociologists speculated that this normalization could either desensitize curiosity or cultivate a more mature relationship with uncertainty, depending on how such material is framed and discussed. And this brought the episode back to the role of media, including the proof is out there itself, in shaping not just present understanding but future attitudes. And the show engaged in a rare moment of self-examination, acknowledging that its editorial choices contribute to a cultural script about how mystery is approached, whether as puzzle, threat, entertainment, or invitation. And this reflexivity deepened the episode's philosophical tone, positioning the series as a participant in the phenomenon it analyzes, rather than an external observer. And as Part 8 continued, it returned to the flying dinosaur image one more time, not to debate its plausibility but to consider its symbolic durability in a future context, proposing that such vivid metaphors may serve as cognitive anchors in an increasingly abstract informational environment, giving shape to otherwise diffuse uncertainty. And while this function can inspire imagination, the episode cautioned that it can also harden speculation into belief if not accompanied by critical literacy, a risk amplified by algorithmic amplification. And this caution led to a discussion of education, with experts advocating for curricula that treat unresolved cases not as curiosities to be believed or debunked, but as exercises in reasoning, empathy, and epistemic humility. And this educational framing aligned with Caleb's own hopes for how his experience might be used, expressing that if the sighting were to persist in public consciousness, he would prefer it to encourage thoughtful questioning rather than definitive conclusions, and this personal wish grounded the episode's broader projections, reminding viewers that the future of uncertainty is shaped by individual choices as much as systemic forces. And as the narrative moved deeper into speculation, it addressed the possibility that some future anomaly might eventually contextualize Caleb's sighting retroactively, providing a framework that makes sense of what currently does not. Yet the episode was careful to emphasize that such retroactive clarity is neither guaranteed nor necessary for meaning, and this stance represented a maturation of the show's approach, moving away from the implicit promise of eventual answers toward an acceptance of open-endedness as a legitimate outcome. And this acceptance was framed not as resignation but as resilience, a capacity to hold questions without collapsing into either credulity or dismissal. And as the episode approached its final movement, it examined how unresolved cases influence innovation, noting that persistent anomalies often motivate new methodologies, new instruments, and new questions, even when they themselves remain unexplained. And this catalytic role of mystery positioned the teen UFO, flying dinosaur, over as potentially productive despite its ambiguity, a stimulus for reflection rather than a problem to be solved. And this idea resonated with a futurist who argued that societies that tolerate uncertainty are better equipped to adapt to complexity, a claim that elevated the case from curiosity to cultural indicator. And as the show returned once more to the rural sky above Caleb's hometown, now filmed with advanced equipment that captured nothing unusual, the absence itself was framed as instructive, illustrating that mystery does not require constant manifestation to exert influence. And in the closing moments, the narrator articulated the episode's central proposition, that the future will not be defined by the elimination of the unknown, but by our evolving relationship to it, and that cases like Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur Over, serve as early lessons in this evolution, challenging audiences to reconsider what they demand from evidence, from witnesses, and from themselves. And as the screen faded, the sense was not of anticipation for revelation, but of preparation for coexistence with uncertainty, a subtle yet profound shift that set the stage for the final chapters of the narrative, where the implications of this coexistence would be tested against new perspectives, new voices, and the enduring human desire to understand what moves just beyond the edge of explanation. Part 9 carried the narrative into a territory that had been implicitly present from the beginning but never fully confronted, the boundary where explanation ends and meaning begins, because by now the proof is out there had exhausted most conventional analytical pathways without exhausting the significance of the case, and this exhaustion itself became the subject. As the episode explored what remains when evidence plateaus yet attention, memory, and interpretation persist, and it opened by acknowledging a quiet truth, that not all investigations are designed to conclude. Some are designed to reveal the contours of our need for conclusion, and the Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur Over case, still unresolved, now served as a living demonstration of that need. And to unpack this, the show examined how different audiences had internalized the case in radically different ways, not as a question to be answered, but as a story to be integrated into existing worldviews. And sociologists explained that unresolved anomalies often function as interpretive mirrors, reflecting prior beliefs rather than reshaping them, which explained why the same footage could reinforce skepticism in some viewers while deepening conviction in others. And this divergence was not framed as failure of reason, but as an expression of how humans construct coherence, drawing on available narratives to stabilize uncertainty. And the episode traced this process carefully, illustrating how the flying dinosaur motif had been absorbed into multiple symbolic systems, from speculative biology communities fascinated by lost lineages, to conspiracy-minded forums interpreting it as camouflage technology, to artistic circles using it as metaphor for repressed ecological memory, and none of these appropriations were endorsed or dismissed outright, instead presented as evidence that unresolved phenomena acquire meaning not through proof but through participation. And this participatory dimension marked a shift in the show's analytical frame, moving from investigation to interpretation, and as Part 9 unfolded, it explored the psychological comfort derived from meaning even in the absence of explanation, noting that for many, assigning symbolic significance to the sighting provided a sense of order that raw ambiguity could not, and this insight was contextualized within broader human behavior, drawing parallels to how ancient cultures responded to unexplained celestial events, transforming disruption into narrative to restore equilibrium. And this historical continuity suggested that while technology has changed the medium of mystery, the underlying cognitive response remains remarkably consistent. And this consistency raised an important question, whether the pursuit of explanation is always the most honest response to anomaly, or whether meaning sometimes precedes and even supersedes understanding. And the episode approached this question cautiously, aware of the risk of romanticizing ignorance. But it nonetheless allowed space for the idea that not all unanswered questions are failures of inquiry. Some are catalysts for reflection, and this distinction became central as the narrative returned to Caleb Henson, now positioned not as a witness or symbol, but as an interpreter of his own experience, reflecting on how his understanding of the sighting had evolved, explaining that while he once sought validation through explanation, he now found greater stability in accepting the event as part of his personal history, without demanding that it resolve into a category. And this acceptance was framed not as surrender, but as agency, a reclaiming of meaning from the external narratives that had overtaken his experience. And the show highlighted this shift as a form of quiet empowerment, suggesting that witnesses need not wait for institutional closure to integrate anomaly into identity, and as the episode broadened this theme, it examined how communities collectively negotiate meaning around unresolved cases, noting that shared ambiguity can function as a social bond, creating spaces for dialogue that are not oriented toward agreement but toward exploration. And this communal aspect was illustrated through moderated forums and discussion groups that had emerged around the case, where participants engaged respectfully across differences, using the sighting as a starting point for broader conversations about perception, evidence, and belief. And the show contrasted these spaces with more polarized environments, arguing that the difference lay not in conclusions but in orientation, whether the unknown was treated as battleground or meeting ground, and this distinction aligned with the show's evolving ethos, which increasingly emphasized inquiry as a social practice rather than a competitive one. And as Part 9 progressed, it addressed a lingering concern that emphasizing meaning over explanation could erode standards of evidence. And to confront this, the episode invited philosophers of science to articulate how meaning and explanation can coexist without collapsing into relativism, explaining that rigorous inquiry does not require emotional detachment, nor does meaning-making necessitate factual compromise, and this nuanced position allowed the narrative to hold tension without resolving it prematurely, reinforcing the idea that complexity need not be simplified to be navigable. And as the episode deepened its philosophical exploration, it revisited the role of language, noting how words like proof, out there, and flying dinosaur shape expectations and frame interpretation, and linguists explain that such terms carry implicit promises that may never be fulfilled, and that reframing language around uncertainty could reduce frustration while preserving curiosity. And this insight prompted a reflective moment where the narrator acknowledged the limitations of the show's own title, recognizing that proof is not always attainable, and that what remains out there may resist proof by its very nature. And this self-awareness marked a turning point, as the series appeared to redefine its mission not as delivering answers but as cultivating discernment, and as Part 9 approached its latter half, it explored how unresolved cases influence creativity, noting that artists, writers, and filmmakers often draw inspiration from ambiguity precisely because it leaves space for imagination. And the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, had already begun to inspire fictional reinterpretations, each amplifying different aspects of the original sighting. And while these works diverged from the factual record, the show treated them as legitimate responses to uncertainty, expressions of how mystery permeates culture beyond investigation. And this cultural permeation was presented not as dilution, but as diffusion, spreading the impact of the case across domains that operate by different rules. And as the narrative returned once more to the sky, it did so not with expectation but with reflection, framing the night above Caleb's hometown as a shared human inheritance, a space that has always invited projection, speculation, and awe, and this framing dissolved the boundary between ancient stargazing and modern anomaly analysis, suggesting continuity rather than rupture. And in this continuity, the episode found its emotional center, proposing that the enduring power of the sighting lay not in what it revealed about the sky but in what it revealed about our relationship to not knowing. And as the episode moved toward its conclusion, the narrator articulated a quiet thesis, that meaning does not wait for explanation but grows alongside it, sometimes in its absence, and that the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over case demonstrates how humans navigate the space between evidence and imagination without fully surrendering to either. And this navigation, though imperfect, is a defining feature of human inquiry, and in the final moments, the show returned to Caleb one last time in this segment, standing beneath the stars, expressing that while he still wondered what he had seen, he no longer felt compelled to resolve the question, because the experience had already given him something durable, a sense of perspective, a reminder of scale, and an acceptance of uncertainty as part of life rather than an interruption of it. And this sentiment echoed the episode's closing reflection, that perhaps the ultimate outcome of the investigation was not an answer but a reframing, a shift from asking what is it to asking what does it mean that we continue to ask. And as the screen faded, Part 9 concluded not with suspense but with contemplation, preparing the ground for the final chapters, where the story would turn inward one last time to consider how such cases ultimately reshape the way we define knowledge itself. Part 10 unfolded with a quieter gravity than what had come before, as the proof is out there turned its attention inward, away from the sky, the footage, and even the social reverberations, and toward a more fundamental question that the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over. Case had been quietly pressing from the beginning, namely how we define knowing itself in a world where information is abundant but certainty remains scarce, and this part of the narrative proposed that the true disruption caused by Caleb Henson's sighting was epistemological rather than empirical, because it exposed the limits of traditional knowledge models that assume observation leads cleanly to explanation. And the episode opened by revisiting the concept of proof, interrogating its cultural weight and emotional authority, noting that proof is often treated as an endpoint, a final seal that closes inquiry. Yet in practice, proof operates within agreed boundaries, dependent on instruments, standards, and consensus that evolve over time. And this framing allowed the show to contextualize the unresolved nature of the case, not as a failure, but as an illustration of how knowing functions under constraint. And philosophers of knowledge were invited to unpack this idea, explaining that much of what humans accept as known rests on probabilistic confidence rather than absolute verification, a reality often obscured by the language of certainty used in science communication. And this insight reframed the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, as a case that fell into the margins where probability could not be easily assigned, leaving observers uncomfortable precisely because it resisted categorization. And as the episode developed this argument, it examined how modern audiences often conflate skepticism with dismissal and belief with naivety, creating a false dichotomy that leaves little room for suspended judgment. And this dichotomy was traced through viewer reactions to the case, showing how pressure mounted for the show to declare a verdict, even as evidence refused to cooperate, and the episode treated this pressure as symptomatic of a deeper cultural impatience, an expectation that every question must terminate in an answer to remain legitimate, and this expectation, the show argued, distorts inquiry by incentivizing premature closure. And as this critique unfolded, it returned to Caleb, now presented not as a passive subject, but as someone who had been forced to confront the mechanics of knowing in his own life, explaining that before the sighting he assumed that seeing equaled understanding, but afterward he learned that perception can exceed explanation, a realization that unsettled him at first but eventually broadened his sense of reality. And this personal shift was mirrored in expert commentary that described how encounters with unresolved phenomena often catalyze epistemic humility, a recognition that knowledge is layered, provisional, and incomplete, and rather than presenting this humility as weakness, the episode framed it as a necessary adaptation to complexity, and as part 10 deepened this perspective, it explored how institutions respond to epistemic uncertainty, noting that science, media, and governance each manage not knowing differently, sometimes prioritizing stability over exploration. And while such prioritization serves practical needs, it can also marginalize experiences that do not fit existing frameworks, a tension exemplified by how Caleb's sighting was processed, analyzed, and ultimately left unresolved. And the episode asked whether new modes of inquiry might be required to address phenomena that sit at the edges of current understanding, modes that do not rush toward explanation, but linger productively in uncertainty. And this question opened a discussion about interdisciplinary approaches, blending empirical analysis with phenomenological accounts, not to dilute rigor but to expand context. And while this idea remained speculative, it reflected the show's evolving stance, that understanding may require integration rather than elimination of ambiguity. And as the narrative continued, it revisited the flying dinosaur motif one final time in this segment, not as claim or symbol, but as a linguistic artifact, illustrating how extraordinary language often arises when ordinary categories fail. And linguists noted that such language is not evidence of irrationality, but of cognitive strain, a creative response to the pressure of describing the indescribable. And this observation softened earlier debates, suggesting that sensational terms may reveal limits rather than intentions. And as the episode approached its latter half, it turned toward the future of inquiry itself, questioning how younger generations raised amid constant uncertainty might redefine what it means to know something. And educators suggested that future literacy may center less on memorization of facts and more on navigation of ambiguity, teaching individuals how to evaluate evidence, recognize limits, and remain open without becoming credulous. And this educational shift was framed as both necessary and inevitable, given the increasing complexity of the informational environment. And within this future-oriented discussion, Caleb's experience was recast yet again, now as a case study in adaptive knowing, an example of how individuals integrate unresolved information without collapsing into confusion or certainty, and this reframing elevated the personal narrative into a broader cultural lesson. And as the episode returned to the night sky, it did so with a changed tone, no longer searching for confirmation, but acknowledging that some aspects of reality may remain permanently provisional. And this acknowledgement did not diminish curiosity but redirected it, encouraging questions that are less about final answers and more about process, context, and consequence. And in the closing movement of Part 10, the narrator articulated what felt like a quiet thesis for the entire series, that the proof is out there is not a promise of resolution, but an exploration of how humans confront the edges of understanding, and that cases like Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur Over, endure not because they resist explanation, but because they force us to reconsider what explanation is for. And as the final images faded, showing the sky once more in its indifferent vastness, the episode left viewers with a reframed challenge, not to decide what Caleb saw, but to examine how they themselves respond when knowledge reaches its limits. A challenge that pointed directly toward the final stages of the narrative, where the implications of this redefinition of knowing would be drawn together, not into answers, but into perspective. Part 11 unfolded as a gradual deceleration, a deliberate slowing of pace that mirrored the stage the investigation itself had reached, because after redefining what it means to know, the proof is out there now turned toward what follows that redefinition. The quiet reckoning that occurs when curiosity no longer demands conquest and uncertainty is allowed to exist without constant challenge. And this reckoning was neither dramatic nor comforting, but reflective, almost intimate, as the episode explored how individuals and societies live after the pursuit of explanation loosens its grip, and it opened by acknowledging that most unresolved cases do not end with revelation, but with accommodation. A subtle adjustment of worldview that absorbs anomaly into the background of experience, and the Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur Over case was now firmly in this phase, no longer pressing for answers but exerting influence through its persistence. And the episode traced how this persistence manifested not through headlines but through small, often invisible shifts in attitude, as viewers, witnesses, and experts alike recalibrated their expectations of certainty. And to illustrate this, the show revisited several panelists from earlier episodes, asking not what they thought the object was, but how the case had affected their thinking, and the responses revealed a convergence that evidence had never achieved, a shared acknowledgement that the investigation had exposed limits, not only of technology but of confidence, and this convergence suggested that while the case resisted resolution, it succeeded in fostering intellectual restraint, a rare outcome in a culture driven by definitive claims. And as the narrative progressed, it examined how such restraint operates on a social level, noting that unresolved phenomena often serve as quiet reminders of humility, tempering extremes without erasing difference, and sociologists describe this as a stabilizing function of mystery, a counterweight to overconfidence that keeps belief systems from ossifying, and this idea reframed the Teen UFO, Flying Dinosaur Over, not as a failure to explain, but as a successful interruption, a moment that slowed certainty long enough for reflection to take hold. And this reframing was grounded once more in Caleb Henson's experience, as he described how the sighting had gradually receded from the foreground of his life without disappearing entirely, becoming something he carried rather than something he chased. And this language of carrying rather than solving became a motif of the episode, suggesting a mature relationship with the unknown that neither denies nor glorifies it. And as Part 11 deepened this theme, it explored the emotional dimensions of unresolved inquiry, noting that letting go of the demand for answers often brings relief, but also a subtle sense of loss, the loss of narrative closure that modern storytelling has trained audiences to expect, and this loss was acknowledged rather than minimized, as psychologists explained that ambiguity can provoke a low-level, enduring tension that must be integrated rather than eliminated, and this integration requires patience, a quality rarely rewarded in contemporary discourse. And yet, the episode argued, patience may be the most honest response to certain classes of phenomena. And this argument was illustrated through a comparison with long-term scientific questions that remained open for centuries before partial resolution, reminding viewers that not knowing is not an aberration, but a recurring condition in the history of inquiry. And this historical perspective softened the urgency that once surrounded the Flying Dinosaur narrative, repositioning it within a continuum of unanswered questions rather than as an exception demanding immediate explanation. And as the episode continued, it addressed a lingering fear, that accepting uncertainty might slide into apathy. And to counter this, experts emphasize the distinction between acceptance and disengagement, noting that the former preserves curiosity while relinquishing control, whereas the latter abandons inquiry altogether, and the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over. Case was presented as an example of acceptance without abandonment, a case that remained open conceptually even as active investigation slowed. And this distinction was embodied in Caleb's own stance, as he expressed continued interest in the unknown without the expectation that it would resolve his experience retroactively, and this balance was framed as a form of wisdom, not innate but learned through exposure to limits. And as the narrative widened one last time, it examined how unresolved cases influence cultural tone over time, noting that societies periodically oscillate between confidence and doubt, and that moments of sustained uncertainty often precede shifts in perspective, encouraging reevaluation of assumptions previously held as secure. And the episode suggested that the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, might function as one such moment, modest in scale but indicative of a broader recalibration. And this suggestion carried the narrative toward its penultimate reflection, asking whether the true legacy of the case would lie not in what it revealed about the sky, but in how it gently unsettled our expectations of mastery. And as the episode approached its final movement, the show returned again to the rural nightscape where it all began, now filmed without commentary, allowing silence to do what explanation could not. And this silence became a space for contemplation rather than frustration, reinforcing the episode's central claim that not all questions are meant to be answered quickly, and that some achieve their purpose simply by being held. And in the closing moments, the narrator articulated this ethos directly, stating that the search for proof does not always culminate in certainty, but it can culminate in perspective, a widening of understanding that accommodates mystery without surrendering rigor. And this perspective, the episode suggested, may be the most durable outcome available, one that endures long after footage degrades and debates fade. And as Part 11 concluded, the sense was unmistakably transitional, as if the narrative had reached a plateau from which it could look back and forward simultaneously, acknowledging that while one more chapter remained, the essential work had already been done, not in solving the mystery, but in learning how to live with it, preparing the ground for a final reflection that would draw these threads together, not into an answer, but into an understanding of why the question mattered at all. Part 12 arrived not as a crescendo, but as a settling, the final movement of teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, unfolding with the awareness that endings are rarely about closure and more often about orientation. And the proof is out there. Used this last chapter to ask what, after all the footage, debates, expert panels, public reactions, and philosophical detours, truly remained once the investigation itself receded into memory. And from its opening moments, the episode made clear that it would not attempt a verdict, because any such attempt would betray the journey that had led here, instead positioning itself as a meditation on residue, the intellectual and emotional traces left behind when an encounter with the unknown has run its course without resolution. And this meditation began by revisiting the timeline, not to rehearse events, but to observe how their meaning had shifted over time, noting that the same images once charged with urgency now felt quieter, less demanding. And this shift was not framed as disinterest but as digestion, the slow process by which extraordinary experiences are absorbed into broader understanding. And the narrator reflected that most mysteries do not end when they are solved, but when they are integrated, when they stop demanding constant attention and instead become reference points. And the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, was presented as having reached this stage, its sharp edges softened not by explanation but by familiarity. And as the episode continued, it examined how this integration played out differently across individuals, returning one final time to the range of voices that had shaped the narrative: skeptics, believers, analysts, and observers. And rather than asking them to restate their positions, the show invited them to articulate what they had learned about their own assumptions. And these reflections revealed a surprising symmetry, as even those who remained firmly skeptical acknowledged a renewed awareness of uncertainty, while those inclined toward belief spoke of increased caution. And this convergence suggested that the case had functioned as a kind of cognitive mirror, reflecting biases back to their holders and encouraging recalibration. And this effect was framed as subtle but significant, because it indicated that the value of the investigation lay not in persuasion but in self-examination. And this theme of inward turn deepened as the episode shifted focus toward Caleb Henson for the final time, presenting him no longer as a witness or subject, but as a narrator of his own aftermath. And Caleb described how the experience had gradually transformed from something external, an object in the sky, into something internal, a reference point for how he understood uncertainty, trust, and perception. And he spoke about moments years later when the memory resurfaced. Unexpectedly, not with anxiety but with curiosity, prompting him to question how often he overlooked ambiguity in everyday life, and this personal evolution was framed as emblematic rather than exceptional, suggesting that encounters with unresolved phenomena often leave their deepest mark not in what is remembered, but in how thinking changes afterward. And as the episode widened its scope again, it explored how such changes accumulate culturally, noting that societies are shaped not only by answers but by the questions they repeatedly fail to resolve. And historians pointed out that enduring mysteries often act as boundary markers, reminding cultures of the limits of their explanatory frameworks at particular moments in time, and the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, was positioned within this lineage, not as a singular anomaly, but as a contemporary instance of an old pattern, where new technologies collide with ancient uncertainties, producing moments of friction that reveal both progress and constraint, and this historical framing lent the case a quiet dignity, lifting it out of the cycle of online debate and situating it within a longer human story. And as Part 12 progressed, it addressed one final tension that had hovered over the series, the fear that leaving questions open might undermine trust in knowledge systems. And the episode confronted this directly, arguing that trust is not built by pretending certainty exists everywhere, but by demonstrating honesty about where it does not, and experts emphasize that resilience in knowledge systems comes from transparency about limits, not from the illusion of completeness. And in this light, the unresolved nature of the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, was reframed as a strength rather than a liability, evidence that inquiry had been conducted without forcing conclusions. And this argument flowed naturally into a reflection on media responsibility, acknowledging that shows like The Proof is Out There walk a narrow line between curiosity and sensationalism, and that the ultimate measure of their value lies not in ratings, but in whether they cultivate discernment. And the episode suggested that by ending without answers, the series honored its audience's capacity to think rather than simply react. And as the narrative entered its final act, it returned once more to the imagery that had defined the case: the dark sky, the ambiguous shape, the language of flying dinosaurs and unidentified craft. And this time these elements were presented almost poetically, stripped of urgency, allowed to exist as symbols of the unknown rather than puzzles to be solved. And the narrator observed that humans have always populated the sky with meaning, projecting fears, hopes, and questions upward, and that the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, was simply the latest expression of this impulse, shaped by contemporary anxieties and technologies but rooted in an ancient relationship with mystery. And this observation tied the case back to something fundamental: the human need to look beyond immediate understanding and imagine more. And as the episode moved toward its conclusion, it articulated what felt like its final synthesis: that the true proof sought throughout the series was never proof of extraterrestrials or prehistoric creatures in the sky, but proof of how humans respond when confronted with the limits of explanation. And by that measure, the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, offered abundant evidence of curiosity, conflict, humility, and adaptation. And the narrator suggested that these responses mattered more than any definitive identification ever could, because they revealed the living process of understanding itself. And in the closing minutes, the show returned to silence, lingering on an empty night sky as the narrator spoke sparingly, noting that the unknown does not disappear when investigations end. It simply waits, sometimes above us, sometimes within us, and the final words did not invite belief or disbelief, but attentiveness, a willingness to notice how questions shape us even when answers do not arrive. And as the screen faded to black, the teen UFO, flying dinosaur over, case was left exactly where it began, unresolved yet transformed, no longer a mystery-demanding solution, but a story that had done its work by changing how we think about proof, perception, and the space between them, leaving behind not certainty but meaning.